That feeling of just being aware. It's the most constant thing in our lives, really, this experience of consciousness.
It absolutely is.
But then try to pin down what it actually is.
Yeah.
And suddenly it feels like trying to grab smoke, doesn't it?
That's exactly the problem. We all have this immediate, personal sense of being conscious, but a solid definition everyone agrees on, still missing, even after centuries of people thinking about it.
Right. And that's what we're getting into in this deep dive. We've looked at philosophy, science, even some really interesting cultural takes to try and get a better handle on it all.
Yeah, it's a real mix.
Our goal, really, is for you listening to come away with a clearer picture of just how complex it is, but hopefully feeling, enlightened, not just confused.
Exactly. We're not aiming for the single answer because honestly, it doesn't seem to exist yet. It's more about showing the different facets, the different angles on this mystery. Maybe give you a fresh way to think about your own awareness.
Okay, so where do we even kick off the basic question?
Yeah.
What is consciousness? You hear simple definitions like awareness of yourself and what's around you.
Right, that's the common one.
But that just feels, well, incomplete,
Yeah.
like it's missing something big.
It is, because while awareness is part of it, it misses the whole subjective feel of it. It's not just about processing data from the world, it's about what it feels like to process it.
Ah, okay. And that gets us to this idea of qualia, right? Like the taste of your morning coffee or the warmth of the sun or seeing a really amazing sunset, even something like pain.
Precisely.
These aren't just like abstract information points, are they? There's a definite quality to them.
That's it, exactly. Qualia are those raw, private, subjective qualities. The what it's like-ness of an experience, the specific redness of red, the unique bitterness of that coffee. They're super personal.
And hard to explain to someone else.
Incredibly hard, especially if they haven't had that specific experience.
Okay, so this is where things get really philosophical. Here's this guy, David Chalmers, and he talks about the hard problem of consciousness. Why is it so hard? I mean, we have brains, they work, consciousness happens. Seems straightforward.
Well, the hard problem, as Chalmers put it, is the really deep question of why and how all that physical stuff happening in our brains, the neurons firing, the chemicals, actually gives rise to subjective experience, to qualia.
Okay.
We can watch the brain activity when you sip coffee. Sure, we see the signals. But how does that electrical pattern become the feeling of bitterness? That jump from the objective physical stuff to the subjective feeling, that's the core of the hard problem.
Because the feeling itself is private. You can't put it under a microscope.
Exactly. It resists that kind of objective analysis.
Got it. Okay, so that's the big challenge. Now let's look at how different thinkers have tried to tackle this. Philosophy first. There's this major split, isn't there, between dualism and materialism.
Yeah, those are the two main camps, historically speaking. Dualism, which you probably connect with René Descartes.
I think, therefore I am.
That's the one. It basically says consciousness isn't just a brain thing. It suggests there's a separate non-physical mind, or maybe a soul, and that's where consciousness lives. His famous line really zeroes in on self-awareness as the key.
So like a ghost in the machine, kind of. A non-physical thing driving the physical body.
That's one way to picture it, yeah. Then you have materialism, which is pretty much the exact opposite. It argues that everything, consciousness included, is ultimately physical. Matter and energy.
No non-physical stuff allowed.
Right. Materialism says consciousness is purely a product of the brain, of neural processes. And, neuroscience gives this view a lot of support. We can see with things like fMRI scans.
Brain imaging.
Right. We see clear links between specific brain activity and being awake, paying attention, thinking about yourself, all that conscious stuff.
So if dualism splits mind and body, materialism says it's all body, essentially. The mind is what the brain does.
That's the core idea. When my brain shows certain activity patterns, that is my feeling of happiness or my thought process according to materialism.
But you said earlier that even for materialists, these qualia, the subjective feelings, are still a problem.
They are. It's a big hurdle. Materialists can point to the neural correlates the brain activity that goes along with an experience, but explaining how those neurons firing actually generate the subjective feeling, that's still really tough. How do electrochemical signals become the rich inner movie we all experience?
Okay, so neither view feels totally satisfying on its own. And then the text brings up this other idea, panpsychism. That sounds out there. Consciousness is everywhere.
Yeah, panpsychism is definitely less common. It's the idea that consciousness isn't something special that just pops up in complex brains like ours. Instead, it might be a fundamental property of the universe.
Like mass or charge?
Kind of like that, yeah. Present in all matter, maybe just to a very, very tiny degree in simple things.
So hang on. My microphone has a little bit of consciousness. My chair.
That's the implication, though we're talking incredibly basic, rudimentary forms. It sounds wild, but it's an attempt to solve that problem of how consciousness just appears out of non-conscious stuff.
Ah, okay. It avoids the sudden emergence problem.
Exactly. It tries to bridge that physical experiential gap by saying experience, in some form, was there all along. It makes you wonder about AI, even simple organisms. Could they have some tiny spark? It's speculative, for sure.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, let's pivot from philosophy to the science side. You mentioned neuroscience is finding correlates. What else?
Well, besides identifying key brain areas like the prefrontal cortex and thalamus, scientists are developing theories about the mechanisms. How does the brain actually generate a unified conscious state?
Right, like the global workspace theory. What's that about?
So, global workspace theory from Bernard Bars uses this metaphor of a theater stage, or maybe like a central computer screen.
Okay.
Lots of unconscious processing happens backstage, but when some piece of information becomes important enough, it gets broadcast onto this central workspace, this stage.
And then everyone can see it.
Sort of, yeah. It gets shared widely across different brain regions, making it available to lots of different systems, memory, planning, language. And that widespread availability is what constitutes the conscious experience. It creates this feeling of a single, unified awareness.
Like putting a spotlight on one important piece of information at a time.
That's a good way to think about it.
And then there's integrated information theory, or IIT. Sounds mathematical.
It is quite mathematical, developed by Giulio Toni. The core idea there is that consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information.
Integrate information, meaning
Meaning how much the different parts of the system work together, how much the whole system knows more than just the sum of its parts. They calculate a value called phi.
phi.
Higher phi means more integrated information, and according to IIT, a richer conscious experience. So a complex, highly interconnected brain would have a high phi, a simple thermostat, very low or zero phi.
Interesting. So it tries to quantify it.
It does, but again, like global workspace, these theories are often better at explaining the functional aspects, how information is processed, how awareness seems to work, rather than nailing that subjective, what it's like, quality. The hard problem still kind of looms.
Right. The feeling itself remains elusive. Now, something else the text highlighted was how different cultures think about this. It's not like everyone sees consciousness the same way.
Not at all. That's a really important point. Our cultural background, even our language, shapes how we conceptualize consciousness pretty dramatically.
How so?
Well, in many Western traditions, there's often this idea of a soul or an enduring self that has consciousness, something potentially separate from the body, maybe even eternal.
Yeah, the idea of a core me that persists.
Exactly, but then you look at some Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, and the view is quite different. Consciousness is often seen as more of a process, a constantly changing flow of mental and physical events, not a fixed thing.
A flow. Like a river, always changing but continuous.
That's a common analogy, yes. And the text mentioned the Buddhist concept of anatta.
Meaning no self.
Right. It directly challenges that idea of a permanent, unchanging self or soul. It suggests that the self we perceive is actually just a temporary collection of these changing processes. A useful construct, maybe, but not a solid, enduring entity.
Wow. That's a radically different way to think about your own awareness.
It really is. It shows just how much our baseline assumptions about consciousness are shaped by our cultural upbringing. There isn't one universal human view.
Makes you think. Okay, shifting gears again. What about consciousness beyond humans, animals, maybe even AI? This always gets people talking.
It definitely raises huge ethical and philosophical questions, doesn't it? When we look at animals, especially mammals and birds, there's a lot of behavior that looks, well, conscious.
Like what?
Problem solving, complex social interactions, seeming displays of emotion, even signs of self-awareness. The text mentioned those studies with dolphins and chimpanzees recognizing themselves in mirrors.
The mirror test. Right. That seems pretty convincing evidence for some kind of self-concept.
It's considered a strong indicator, yes. But then things get muddier with, say, insects or plants or AI.
Ah, AI, the big question mark. As these systems get smarter, can they become conscious?
That's the debate. Right now, the general consensus among scientists and philosophers is that current AI, even the really sophisticated stuff like large language models, probably lacks genuine subjective experience.
So they can mimic conversation, but there's no lights on inside, no feeling.
That's the dominant view. They process information, they follow patterns, they generate output that looks intelligent or even emotional, but there's likely no actual what it's like to be that AI, no qualia.
But the possibility is there as they get more complex.
The possibility forces us to really think about what consciousness requires. Is it biology? Is it a certain kind of information processing? We don't know for sure. So the question remains open, even if most think the answer is no for now.
It's a tricky boundary to define,
Right.
which brings us nicely to the next challenge.
How do you even measure consciousness? It's not like temperature or weight.
Exactly. That's a fundamental problem.
Yeah.
Consciousness isn't directly observable from the outside. You can't just point a device at someone and get a consciousness reading.
So what do we use?
We rely on proxies, indirect indicators, things like measuring brain activity patterns associated with awareness, observing behavior, are they responding to stimuli appropriately, and of course asking people what they're experiencing, verbal reports.
So we're inferring it based on these outward signs.
Pretty much. And each has limitations. Brain scans show correlation, not causation, and don't capture the subjective quality. Behavior can be misleading. And self-reports rely on introspection, which can be unreliable or biased.
Right. So there's this tension between the first-person view, my own subjective experience, and the third-person view, objective data. Exactly. The challenge is bridging that gap. Many researchers think the best approach involves combining both, using objective measures alongside carefully gathered subjective reports. It's like trying to understand a piece of music just by analyzing the sound waves versus actually listening to it. You need both.
That makes sense. And it's funny, isn't it? In everyday life, we just take our own consciousness completely for granted.
We absolutely do. We're just aware. We see, we feel, we think, without constantly questioning how or why. It's the water we swim in.
It's only when you stop and think about it, like we're doing now, that you realize what a deep, profound mystery it still is. Is it just something that happens when brains get complicated enough, an emergent property?
Or is it something more fundamental about reality itself, something we just haven't grasped yet?
Or something else entirely we haven't even conceived of?
These are the big questions still on the table. And as we've seen, every perspective, philosophical, scientific, cultural, gives us a piece of the puzzle, but none has the whole picture yet.
Maybe the difficulty in defining it comes from the fact that it is us. It's the lens we see everything through. How do you examine the lens itself?
That's a great way to put it. It's so intimate, so foundational to our being, that stepping outside of it to analyze it objectively might be inherently problematic.
So maybe aiming for one single definition is missing the point. Perhaps it's more like appreciating that it's this complex interplay of awareness, perception, memory, self-reflection.
All shaped by our biology, our culture, our personal history. Yeah, maybe it's not one thing, but a dynamic process, a tapestry woven from many threads.
That feels closer somehow.
I think so too.
So we've traveled through quite a landscape here, exploring different views on this enigma, but we still circle back to that core question. What does it actually mean to be conscious?
And as we found, there's no simple, neat answer waiting for us. Hopefully, though, this deep dive has shed some light on just how complex and fascinating this topic is and why people are still working so hard to understand it.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe the real takeaway for you listening isn't finding a final definition, but gaining a deeper appreciation for the sheer richness and mystery of your own subjective world.
Exactly. Perhaps understanding consciousness isn't just an intellectual puzzle to solve, but also an invitation to pay more attention to the experience itself.
Right. To just appreciate the wonder of being aware, a feeling of, well, of just being here. So maybe as you go about your day, just take a moment now and then. Notice your own awareness. Consider the reality it presents to you. It really is quite incredible, isn't it?
It truly is. The deepest mystery might be the one we experience every single moment.